die in the Anthropocene. And Jason Moore, who was with us recently, just talks about how capitalism kills. And, do you ever get frustrated? I mean, I saw a post yesterday from the National Observer about how fossil fuels are outdistancing renewables or crushing renewables. And it was really discouraging. And then there was a post on the David Suzuki site about the extinction of caribou. And there's this onslaught of bad news or horrible news that just seems to become overwhelming. And at some point, I just want to turn it off, and I can't be alone. So how do you as a thought leader, how do you as a scientist, retain some optimism and carry on?
That's a really excellent question. I think it's perfectly normal for people to feel grief, for people to feel hopelessness, to feel overwhelmed and sad and angry and frustrated and guilty for being a part of the system that we have right now that has gotten us where we are. I think those things are really normal to feel, and we have to let ourselves do that. I also think that grief and hope can be in the same space and kind of need to be in the same space. Not that we can multitask, because I don't think we can do that, but we can have grief and we can think that we might be able to do something about it. In the last 3 years, the total global emissions have stayed fairly steady at about 10 gigatons of carbon a year. That's not a good amount of emissions for us, right? We need to really reduce that. But if it is a leveling off, and if it is an indication that perhaps we're going to start decreasing our overall global emissions, then that's a positive sign. We have to do it fast. Unfortunately, the timelines are really short, and they get shorter all the time, right? And we as you say, you can only listen to the bad news for so long until you need to take a break and do the things that you do in your lives. I mean, one thing Daniel Gilbert, a psychologist from Harvard, maybe, talks about is that we're just not evolutionarily very prepared to deal with a long-term, slow-acting threat. We're pretty good at dodging a baseball bat if we can see it coming, but that's something that's fast. And we don't see the slow change. So last year it seems kind of the same as this year, but really, if you look at the data, it's not really. So how do we get around that? I think we have to be really deliberate about it and recognize that maybe our human brains aren't really equipped for this, and we have to work to
adapt.
Yeah, we have to put deliberate effort into our actions that we're going to take.
We're talking about climate change and the many faces of it. One of those faces is education. And how important is the understanding of climate change?
So that's a question I think about fairly frequently because it's what I do, and it's always a little bit disconcerting.
You've created an online course as well.
That's right. So I have a free online course that's available to anyone with an internet connection around the world. And that's an avenue for people to connect with other folks around the world and to share what's going on with climate change in their area. And so, I do put a lot of effort into providing learning opportunities for people in climate science. And I also have to question how much impact does that kind of work have? And I remember being at the American Geophysical Union meeting, I think this was in 2011, and Dan Kahan from Yale was presenting some work that showed essentially that science literacy and numeracy actually had a negative impact on people's risk perception around climate change. So that the more scientifically literate you were, the less you perceived climate change as a risk. And I remember sitting there thinking, wow,
that's surprising.
So what I do is actually, not working. And it turned out that really the dominant factors in risk perception are people's values and people's worldviews. And so, if you separate people out by their worldviews, so if you have on the one hand, people who believe in sort of hierarchical systems and the individual being responsible for him or herself, then those people, if they're more science literate, saw less risk than people who were less science literate. And people who had a more egalitarian view of the world and a more communitarian approach to how they think society should be structured, if they knew more in terms of science, then their risk perception went up. One of the issues, though, with Dan's work was that he wasn't using a measure of climate science knowledge. He was using a measure that was sort of general numeracy and general science literacy. And so we have since actually produced an instrument that is about measuring, a validated instrument that measures climate science literacy. And still, though, if you look at the general public, there's just a little bit of impact. So people with more climate science literacy have a little bit more risk perception around it. And risk perception is still really swamped by people's worldviews and what they value. In particular, people with sort of biospheric values, people who value what we'd call nature for nature's sake, see some intrinsic value separate from whether or not nature is good for humans. People who value that have a higher risk perception of climate change. But there's a little signal of climate science literacy, in particular, in that risk perception. So in the general public, that's a positive sign, even though it's just really swamped by worldviews and values. But in younger people, in university populations and younger, what it looks like is that learning climate science actually can have more of an impact on risk perception. And maybe it's having an impact through influencing people's worldviews or values. Maybe it's having an impact more directly through learning about the problem and the science around the problem. I don't think we know what pathway that is taking. But I see that as an opportunity, right? So again, it's a turnover of a generation kind of opportunity. And what I think we need to think about is how do we structure climate science education so that in addition to learning the basics of science, there are ways in which people are also evaluating their own values in that. I don't know necessarily how we do that, but that's what this research seems to point to.
How do we change the conversation? How do we, I think about Jonathan Haidt, and I think about the discussion about, conservatives and liberals, that even though we have access to the scientific information, even though we say we understand it, we can still, as a society, have different beliefs and values about how to deal with it. And I don't want to simplify it by saying, how do you talk to a denier? But how do you have a conversation with somebody who doesn't see the world the same way that you do?
Yeah, what I understand about the research coming out in communications on that front is about finding some common ground in the beginning, right? There are things that we all have in common, and if you can find some connection to a person, then we can immediately see ourselves as colleagues somehow.
That reminds me of Catherine Hayhoe, who says, "I'm a Christian, just like you, and I'm also a scientist." And so it's interesting. She would do that in church to create a common bond with the congregation, but then go into a climate change discussion.
Yeah, Catherine Hayhoe is the person I was going to bring up because she's exactly she is such a wonderful example of so Catherine Hayhoe is an evangelical Christian. She's Canadian. She lives in Texas. She works at Texas Tech, and she's a climate science scientist herself, and she's taken it on to be a climate science communicator. And she has that in. She is a trusted messenger in a group of people who are evangelical Christians. And I don't know necessarily enough about evangelical Christianity myself. My understanding is that there are some some groups who see their work as actually stewards and see a connection to acting on climate change, and there may be others who see what's happening as what is God's will, and therefore they don't have any control. But the point is, I think that Catherine Hayhoe is a trusted messenger, and we need those trusted messengers who can reach people who they have connections with. I might be a trusted messenger in some other setting. I probably am not a trusted messenger in the same places that Catherine Hayhoe is in. I'm so grateful for her work in that realm because particularly in North America, there is a large percentage of the population to whom her message might resonate.
Yeah. So how do you start those conversations? How do you bridge that gap in your circle of influence?
Well, I think you can, yeah. I don't know necessarily. I live in a space often that I don't actually encounter people who are strongly deniers. And in fact, even in the course, the online course, when we first started it, it was in 2013, and it was really fascinating. We were the first climate change free open online course, or what are called MOOCs, massive open online courses. We were the first one that came out, and so there was a lot of interest. And we had, a handful of people who were on our discussion forums who were doing things that people on the denier end of the spectrum do. They put in a whole lot of information that then, each individual thing needs to be rebutted, or it seems very plausible. So we had a bunch of people in there who were doing that. We also had wonderful people, particularly someone from Skeptical Science. I don't know if you know the Skeptical Science website, who was in there and knew the tools to engage with these people online. And a course is a little bit of a different online space than sort of the Wild West of the internet, right? So people in a course have chosen to be there and they've signed up. And but we did have them in there in 2013, and now it's 2017. This course has gone to a new platform, and it used to be a course that both Sarah Birch and I taught together, and it had the science and it had the policy and governance. Now we've just put the science part on edX.org, and I don't really have any people who might fit in the denier camp on the discussion forums anymore. So I don't know whether that's a feature, a function of more.
Must be refreshing.
It is. There are many more climate courses out there now. It's not just the one. And also, I think, it's possible that there just are fewer of those people. I think maybe that's.
Sara Harris is with us. She's an author, a UBC professor, a climatologist, a scientist, and a whole bunch of things. I think you're also the assistant dean.
Yeah, I'm associate dean academic. I've only been doing it for 3 weeks. So.
Congrats.
Thank you.
The question I stumble on sometimes is hopefulness and hopelessness. And clearly, reading your book, you're pretty optimistic. You said in your book that it's unlikely that we'll turn the clock back for the world to be like it was 200 years ago. But what kind of future do you see?
Yeah, I would like to see a future where we have something better than we have now. And you're right, we're not going to turn back the clock. It's no ecosystem that has changed. It's going to go back to the way that it was, right? The cod on the Grand Banks and the removal of cod has probably changed that ecosystem. And so even though ecosystems are going to be different, are there ways in which we can transition to something that is more stable for human communities and also for ecosystems around us, less disruptive, working with the natural systems that are around us, to create human communities where we can actually deal with a catastrophic flood without it being actually catastrophic. How do we do that, right? I think it comes down to, again, long-term decisions and commitment to long-term policies that are going to move us in that direction. I think it's really, really hard. The problems are huge, right? We can get back to being overwhelmed and hopeless. I mean, the CO2 that the ocean has kindly been taking out of the atmosphere for us is causing ocean acidification and all sorts of changes in ecosystems there in the marine environment. I feel like without aiming for something that is going to be good aiming for something that is going to minimize the future suffering